My name is Tristan McKinnon. I'm the principal data engineer for Axel Informatics, and I run a private research lab out of Eugene, Oregon called Deterministic Systems Labs. Today I'm here to talk to you about a framework that we worked out at Axel Informatics to address inconsistencies in the application and interpretation of a FedRAMP AC6 or NIST SP 853, which is least privilege. So I'm going to kind of walk through how the framework works, what the issues are, and finally look at the limitations that it presents. 90 days is the problem. The typical best practice is you rotate your credentials every 90 days. This means that if a identity is compromised, there are, on the first day that a credential is issued, there are 90 days where that attacker has access to everything that that credential has access to. And in the case of many environments, we're looking at the entirety of a bucket, an entire directory system, or, best case, a prefix. But, I mean, that's huge when you think about it, because this isn't just, miscellaneous data, this isn't just our reputation. These are, in the case of what we're working with as a NIH-related healthcare pipeline, these are people's genomes, like with multi-generational identification capable. These are cancer diagnosis, AIDS diagnoses, psychiatric histories. These are people's lives. And so when they signed up to participate in research. They didn't sign up to have a 90-day window of vulnerability with the most sensitive aspects of their identity. So just to step back, because we built our environment first in AWS. And if you aren't familiar with the AWS environment, I just kind of want to run through real fast. So, in our case, I'll refer to something like a ingestion identity. And the idea of that is an identity is like wow, my brain just fell out, I'm sorry. Like a service account is essentially, in the case of most people, like what you use to log in, the permissions that you have to work around. But in the case of what I'm talking about, we're looking at non-human identities. We're looking at the persistent identities attached to this compute. And so what that is the permission and control that runs, that has the authorization to touch everything that compute needs to touch. And then in my case, we have data coming in, landing in an S3 storage bucket, and then it's being processed using some form of compute, either Lambda or Glue, and it's finally landing in our regulated data lake. And like I said before, the typical IAM role, we're looking at entire bucket or directory or a prefix, and TTL is the time to live, and that's how long that credential is good for. In the typical case, like I said, best practice is listed as 90 days, and that is 90 days of exposure, where anyone who compromised that could access everything that identity can access. So, best practices people talk about will be, we can shorten that lifespan down to 30 days. That's still 30 days of access where that blast radius is everything that object can touch. Or you could add MFA, great, but it can still be cracked very easily in this era of AI applications. Because the idea is not that you need to build walls that can't be penetrated, because that's not realistic. AI attacking agents can penetrate pretty much every environment that exists. Instead, the issue is controlling lateral movement, containing the blast radius. You want to cut down as much as possible what they can access once they're in. So the architecture of what I built over at Axel is pretty straightforward. It goes from left to right. Data can only move in one direction. There is no reverse. So first I have data landing in what we refer to as the dirty zone. And what that is basically we have an environment that is completely cut off from any access. It has one relationship, which is with Airbyte. And Airbyte only has write permission. And so the reason why we're using Airbyte is because you can hard code those connection relationships. So there's no way for anyone who isn't hard coded as a connection to drop data into that bucket. And out of that, no person has read access. Like I'm the creator and controller of our pipeline, and I can't read the bucket. The only thing that happens is when something lands in that bucket, it creates an event saying, hey, a new object arrived. And so what happens then is our identity broker issues a token to spin up an ephemeral compute in the airlock. And what happens there is essentially that compute has access to exactly one file to read only the file out of the dirty bucket. And then it processes it, goes through, uses, we use Presidio for our NLP for de-identification, scrubs it for any identification issues, normalizes it, cleans it up, makes sure there's no virus issues or anything else, and then has write-only permission into our clean governed lake. So there's basically what happens is this identity is written as an STS inline identity. It can read one thing, it can write one thing, can't go either direction. So it can only access that one object. The idea here being that if it were compromised, that's exactly one object they can access. And the other important part is that STS tokens have exactly 900 seconds as the maximum amount that they can live. It can't be modified, it can't be overwritten. That is part of the core infrastructure of how inline STS works. So if someone were to get a hold of it, at most they can play around for 15 minutes, but they can only access the one token. And the best part of all is we have it set up so that once the object, whatever file it is processed, it deletes behind itself. So if they get it after the first couple of minutes, congratulations, they can look at nothing. So I kind of walked through that workflow, but yeah, so an object arrives, it's identified, the policy is issued, that token exists, the file is processed, tokenized, and just to emphasize, because I realize I kind of flipped through that there, in that airlock, there is no persistent storage, and the compute is spun up on demand. So there's it never lands, it never touches anywhere that isn't 100% intentional. All right, and then finally, when we ran this as a pilot, this is the measurement that we captured. The typical, because the first concern was that by creating this situation where we're spinning up ephemeral compute, we're generating identities on the fly, we're going to create a lot of latency in our pipeline. But interestingly, once warmed up, we were looking at 800 millisecond latency. Cold start, we ranged between 340 and 440 milliseconds of start time. But then once that was just for the very first processing on the pipeline. Once it was up and running, yeah, 180 milliseconds. Maximum issuance that we ran into under general batch issues were about 40 identities per minute, but we stress tested it up to the maximum limit of 3,000 concurrent lambdas. But we did not reach the maximum STS, which was 2,000 calls per second, because that is a lot. But the beautiful thing is it worked with no real notable latency, because the idea is that 180 milliseconds may sound like a bit, and in very high throughput pipelines that would be the case. But for the work that we're doing here, we have average files of around 400 to 500 gigabytes. 180 milliseconds is about 0.1% of the total processing time. I mean, that's nothing. That's ephemera. So just to be completely honest in the framing, we did have some interesting bumps along the way. The first one was our race condition issue, where as a couple of identities were being issued in rapid succession, one of them was double used. But because of the way that everything is intrinsically tied, it didn't work, and it created a failure. And the best part is how our logs are done, because the logging that we have set up, because your log is meant to help you. Your log is not meant to be a place where you violate your security and your privacy. It's true. Because so often, like, just as a sidebar, I can't even get over the times that I've been working for hospitals, and I'll be looking through the logs, and I'm like, oh look, there's an entire demographic string just caught in the log. And it's terrifying. So we have our log set up basically to record the action, which is the specific requirement of AU2, which is of FedRAMP, which is a reasonable log in history. So it records the identity that was issued, the object address that was issued to, the process that happened, and then it has a canary hash, which basically is an SHA-256 hash of all the above information. So if there's disagreement in any way, the log was modified, even though it's written to worm, write only, I forget what it's called, but anyway, where you can't write it once and it's immutable, but just in case. And that creates a very foolproof structure that, for us, keyed that we'd had a mistake. And then, like I said, how we found it was because of the canary hash breaking, which was glorious and useful. The other nice thing about this is that in the case of someone invoking, let's say, their GDPR Article 15 right of removal, we can follow the exact chain of that object through our entire pipeline. So we can prove where it went, which lets us prove its removal, which is also pretty nice. Now, to be honest, this is something that was called out in the review when I submitted this talk, and it's a valid point, which is that we haven't removed a root of trust, we've just moved it to the broker. So some critical questions, because yes, the broker is the new root of trust. If someone were to violate it, then they could issue new tokens on their own, they could theoretically do things. So we've taken some safeguards on this, and I feel fairly good about this. First off, that identity broker exists with no endpoint to reach, no internet access, no API. The only way that it is triggered is by an S3 notification on the dirty bucket. And again, that dirty bucket is only accessible through hard-coded error byte flow. So there's no way that someone reasonably could trigger it. And then if they did trigger it, all they do is trigger to the object they created. On top of that, we added a bijective enforcement. So this is a true deterministic guardrail around our system, which was one of the points in the panel yesterday. Because the idea is we track objects in and identities issued. If there's ever a variance of any level whatsoever, the system is killed and we review. And then finally, in the worst case that someone still manages to hijack it, they get 900 seconds of access, 15 minutes of access, which when compared to the normal 90-day credentials that we're talking about, that is an order of magnitude of 4 orders of magnitude of difference. So again, it's not zero risk because, to be perfectly honest, in this AI era, zero risk is a lie that we tell ourselves to feel good at night. But it's bounded, it's monitored, it's structurally constrained, and it's the best I could do to respect the information that's been entrusted to us by our patients. So what it solves. I mean, first off, it's trying to eliminate the risk of persistent identity. When we work through with through our cleaning, we remove the 18 HIP identifiers, so, name, date of birth, geographic information, device information, things like that, so that theoretically the information in our data lake is clean and de-identified. But we still need, we still want to make sure that things along the way there are tracked. So we have that unidirectional data flow so that there's no way for earlier locations to read more sensitive data or vice versa. And we have that hash-chained audit lineage, which ensures that we can track everything that's happened and we could follow up in the case of any types of concerns down the road. What we don't do is, like in the case of genomic data, so VCFs, spam files, things like that, hashing the headers doesn't really do anything. And that's an open issue of research in general, is how to de-identify genomic data without removing the entire reason why we get it. So we can't really deal with that one. We just do the best we can, which is controlling how it's accessed. And it's a sensitive one because, if my genomic data is analyzed, it doesn't just expose me, it exposes my parents, my children. So that's one we want to be very careful with, and we're working on that. Additionally, it doesn't necessarily address app level vulnerabilities, like the Athena that reads the database, et cetera, and we're working on that one as well. I have some things coming down the pipeline. And then finally, like inferential and linkage attacks is something that another project is working on, but this doesn't address that. So just kind of summarize like everything that's going on here. If you walk away with anything, just think about that architecture flow of complete isolation to the point where we're even isolating from human contact. At this point, we have an entire pipeline where from ingestion all the way to cutting the cohorts when we expose these in our trusted research environment, no human being can touch anything in that pipeline. It's all a complete chain of pre-programmed CI/CD controlled code triggered on a one-to-one basis with every object. The idea there is that at no point when it's sensitive, complete data can a human see it. Then we use a programmatic process in order to cut the cohorts, which we then feed into a trusted research environment. And that's probably the one that when I talk about app level sensitivity, that's probably one of the biggest ones that we worry about is once it's in the trusted research environment, but that's another issue as well. Things that I'm working on right now, kind of excited to work on looking at streaming options like HL7, which is like a high data rate piece of medical EHR data, words. And for that one, I'm looking at methods of using the EBF and XDP to try to do kernel level identity control. And if any of you are really good at C or Rust, I would love a collaborator. And then beyond that, looking at things like agentic trust bootstrapping, because as AI gets involved and ETL stops being pure code, it gets a lot harder to track and control. And then finally, looking at SPI FFE at broker scale, so high volume data again, where you have multiple concurrencies, it gets a little bit tricky. But I mean, that's the biggest thing of it. Oh, and just to mention, because processes like this can be complicated for people who aren't as familiar to implement, I packaged all this up also into a library called PyMayfly. It's pip installable and accessible. And it does have support not just for AWS, which is I only talk about because that's what we piloted in, but also for Azure GCP. And soon I'll have HashiCorp Vault as well for those who are on-prem services as well. If you have any questions or curiosity, you can also look it up. I have a paper that's being printed in IEEE Big Data Security, but the preprint is available on Tech Archive if you want to take a look. And otherwise, please feel free to shoot me an email or reach out to me if you have any questions. Cool.
Thank you.